Hello there, I'm Dr. Jordan Peterson, and today I'm surrounded by 25 atheists.
All right, so recently, as you see, Jordan Peterson just went on Jubilee to debate 25 atheists. And what I want to highlight is a discussion between him and a young woman when she asked him, what is a Christian? And his answer is...
So what makes someone a Christian and what makes someone not a Christian?
Probably the deepest answer to that is willingness to shoulder your cross voluntarily and trudge uphill regardless of circumstances.
Okay, so Peterson's answer to what is a Christian is essentially voluntary self-sacrifice, overcoming trial, going uphill, etc. And this is what he would say is the deepest meaning or the deepest answer for what a Christian is.
Right, so someone can believe in God, right, and not be a Christian.
So this woman kind of deduces someone can then believe in God propositionally, like I believe that is the case that there is a God, but not be a Christian because this person does not voluntarily self-sacrifice.
Right.
Yeah, well, there's a statement that Christ makes in the Gospels. He says, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Christ himself points out that there's a difference between people who say they believe and people who act it out. And the fundamental issue is the action rather than the stated belief.
So Peterson answers to her question, yes, someone can have a propositional belief in God, but not have a Christian belief because action is fundamental to be a Christian rather than a propositionally stated belief. And this is going to be the theme for how Jordan Peterson differentiates a Christian from a non-Christian. But even still, he'll have to specify further what, who, and when someone is a Christian.
But he also says that, to be saved, right, you must believe God has died for your sins or that God has resurrected in some way.
Now, she has a rebuttal here. Peterson has just said it's action, not proposition, that undergirds belief. And she says, no, according to the Bible, stating belief propositionally is also necessary. Now, she doesn't quote this book in the Bible or chapter or verses, but here's something that supports that. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. So again, propositionally stating Jesus is Lord grants salvation, grants this idea of Christian status. Let's see how Jordan Peterson interacts with that.
I don't necessarily think that we can take from the Bible and say that acting in accordance with God necessarily means, or acting in accordance with, the principles of God, like for example, sacrifice, like you talk about, means that you are Christian.
I don't think that the fact that you sacrifice is sufficient to make you Christian.
Okay, so the counterclaim again is with propositional evidence, a stated belief, mere sacrificing is not in itself necessary to be a Christian. And then Peterson agrees. He kind of alters a little bit here. He says sacrifice alone is not sufficient to be a Christian. So his original working definition, the kind of deepest answer, deepest meaning is a Christian is someone who voluntarily self-sacrifices. But now he's saying a sacrifice alone is not sufficient to be a Christian.
So can we repeat once again what you believe makes someone Christian?
And understandably, she's a little confused. I was a little confused. Maybe some of you were confused. So she requests some clarity. So either is it the case that all that is necessary to be a Christian is taking on this voluntary self-sacrifice, which he first kind of stated, or is it being a Christian is, taking on the voluntary self-sacrifice plus other condition.
There's many things, but one of the most fundamental is that you believe that the cosmos itself is founded on the principle of voluntary self-sacrifice. Best founded.
Okay, so I'm not sure how much we just got here, but he clarifies there are many things that make someone a Christian, but most fundamental is voluntary self-sacrifice. It's how the cosmos is oriented, he says. So I'm not really sure if this has gotten us clarity. Again, what is a Christian? Is it voluntary self-sacrifice solely or additionally? He says it is fundamentally, but has not added on what else can be contributed to get someone that actual Christian status, or someone is actually a Christian by mere voluntary self-sacrifice. We got a moving target here.
Someone does not have to have any awareness of Christ, of the story of Jesus, but let's say 60% of their actions, right, or more, whatever kind of metric you want to use, are in line with this self-sacrificial.
Yeah.
So she interrogates, then is it the case that even if someone has never heard of Christ, yet most of their actions, 60%, maybe more, maybe 80% of their actions, live a life that take on a posture of voluntary self-sacrifice? Is this person a Christian?
Yeah. The Christian thinkers of the Middle Ages dealt exactly with that problem when they were talking about the pre-Christian philosophers, for example.
Okay, so here's where things get a little bit more murky and messy, and let's try to unpack this. So her question was, if someone lives a life that mostly kind of resembles this voluntary self-sacrifice, are they Christian? And then Peterson answers, Christian thinkers of the past contemplated this. But now, what does he mean by Christian? This conversation in itself is to work out what Christian firstly means. We're trying to come to a definition of Christian, and now he has employed the word and term Christian thinkers, to help answer what Christian means. Okay, he even says pre-Christian. Does that mean voluntary self-sacrifice Christian? Or is there a certain template he has in his mind for some historical Christian, which I think he is getting at? And this is going to not make his case very strong or logical.
Yeah. They noted the similarity, let's say, between pre-Christian Greek thought and later Christian thought, and presumed that there were moral actors outside the Christian domain.
Right.
Okay, so again, he's doubling down on this idea of there being a Christian thought, a Christian domain that emerged after the Greeks, that emerged to be our historical kind of Christian thought, dogma, ideas that we can refer to today. But is he merely talking about people? Is Christian thought, is a Christian domain merely people who have virtually self-sacrificed without propositions, without creeds, without proclamations about Jesus Christ being Lord? There's no way. I mean, Peterson compared Greek thought with Christian thought, but what is this thought to even have comparison reference to? And just even, common sense, if you're reading any creeds or church history, this kind of language of a Christian being someone who just voluntarily self-sacrifices, that wasn't a paradigm. So there's a word for this, and it is equivocation, or more specifically, the equivocation fallacy. This is when you use a similar word that contains separate meanings to argue a certain point, and then it becomes ambiguous. The argument gets hard to grasp, and then that's how the arguer kind of gets his point across, or sneaks his point across. So let's walk through this. So the person who has not heard of Christ is still possibly a Christian because they mostly exemplify moral behavior that is voluntarily self-sacrificial and in line with historical Christian teaching thought. Peterson is, perhaps unknowingly, appealing to beliefs, theology of the historical Christian thought, creeds and teachings. He has to demonstrate that these Christians are the same, quote, Christians, the VSS Christians he is trying to define as merely or mostly the voluntary self-sacrificers. Otherwise, this is equivocation. The virtual self-sacrificing Christian is only confirmed for Peterson by this historical Christian. But these words, right, the one in blue is not the same Christian in green that he's making reference toward to try to drive home his definition of the Christian in blue font. Yeah, and this is the equivocation fallacy. And it's also circular. So let me do an example for how this is circular. In an attempt to define what a woman is, Walsh explains a woman is that who does what women do according to women thought. But what is a woman? Now, with Christian, let's just really swap the words out here, because this is what Peterson is doing. and attempted to define what a Christian, voluntary self-sacrificing Christian is, Peterson explains a Christian is he who does what Christians do according to Christian thought, as Christians have done or thought historically. But what is a Christian?
Made.
Right.
They're
so is that person
addressing
Christian, though? Is that person Christian?
Well, to some degree, again, that's a matter of definition, because
Exactly.
they wouldn't be proclaiming Christian propositions, but they're acting out the pattern.
And again, she's not letting Peterson go on this. So are these individuals Christians, right? The individuals that conducted themselves with a voluntary self-sacrificial life before Christ or unknowing of who Christ is. And he says, well, it depends on how you define it. But yeah, this is what she's asking of you to do with her line of questions, that she's asking you to define it. And Peterson responds, well, it depends, because they act out of a voluntary self-sacrifice pattern, but do not proclaim Christian propositional belief. And again, he's doing Christian equivocation. He's saying these Christians who are doing voluntary self-sacrifice actually don't make Christian propositional belief. But what does that mean? Is Christian propositional belief voluntary self-sacrificial propositional belief?
Right. So so you imagine that full Christianity would involve a dozen things. And you can imagine someone who knows nothing of Christianity, say, acting out 8 of them.
Right.
Right. So then they'd be 8/12 Christian or something like that.
Christian.
Well,
so now, rather than being stuck with an either or, Peterson opts to instead make a Christian something that is quantifiable and in terms of degrees. So therefore, someone cannot know the life story of propositions of Christ or Christian thought, but may still be mostly Christian.
But to be like a full Christian, how can someone say, I am Christian? Like, I am Christian, not 8/12, but Christian.
Great question. She understands that with faith and identity, there's something counterintuitive and nonsensical of only being proportionately something. Like, imagine if I'm 8/12 male, or I'm 8/12 a father, I'm 6/12 daughter, or I'm 3/12 a student even, or a pro basketball player. There's got to be something else than like a percentage or metric to make someone something. You either are or you aren't, depending on, proclamation, involvement, etc. And Peterson's rather opts for a spectrum or a metric system that has degrees to advance or digress on that spectrum of identity.
Well, I hesitate to do that personally, because I think it's the kind of goal that you be very careful about proclaiming.
And Jordan Peterson, he sees this as an arduous task for even himself. And this is another note, maybe I'll make a video on this, but this is, I think, the Peterson paradox and the difficulty of Peterson's approach to this. It's just impractical, and only a few can do this. Only Peterson can scrutinize Christianity like this, maybe a couple other people, and live in this kind of gray area of how he treats this term. Because really, the paradox is, if all Christians were as scrutinous as Jordan Peterson to identify as Christians, there would be no Christianity for Jordan Peterson to contemplate or scrutinize. Right? Because if everyone had that high degree of skepticism to call themselves Christian or to promote a Christian gospel, it wouldn't have gotten to Jordan Peterson at the end of the day.
But belief is not necessarily, to be mostly Christian, belief is not necessary.
She means belief is propositional when she says belief rather than JP's belief as action. And he's going to pin her down on here, but it's kind of getting belabored at this point, and I wish Jordan Peterson would try to work to understand what people mean before he tries to get them to understand what he means or what he wants them to mean when they actually say a word.
Right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by belief. See, because I would say that acting out the pattern is the deepest form of belief.
We know by now that Jordan Peterson understands belief as action. I think Jordan Peterson needs to assume that she and most people begin and remain with belief as propositional. And I think for good faith argumentation, Jordan Peterson needs to understand that's what people mean by belief. And if he wants to even put himself in their shoes to rather choose the word I think, then he ought to do that, because he needs to learn how to steelman their positions and understand what they mean, rather than be like, what do you mean by this? Well, here's what you should actually mean, because this is the word what the word means. It's this kind of self-serving semantic gravitational pull where Jordan Peterson wants everyone to use his lexicon, his dictionary, or else the argument can't proceed. It's not fair, it's not good faith, and it's not helpful. I think Jordan Peterson needs to really begin to shift to do the work on what people mean and come to them, especially with theology, because this is just not his wheelhouse.
Now, you could add to that what you say. So, maybe in the optimal situation, how you act and what you imagine and what you say, they're the same.
Okay, I think this is pretty good. I think this could be a solid middle ground. Optimal belief is what you say, proposition, what you do, action, and what you imagine, right? What's internalized in your head and heart. And again, I'm not going into Bible or too deep into theology, but I think this does kind of encapsulate the authentic belief or the authentic faith that Scripture presents. But Peterson is saying it here, but he seems to kind of sideline the say and the imagine compared to the do that he puts at the top of the hierarchy.
Right, but you can imagine a hypocrite who says all sorts of wonderful things and does nothing, and you could imagine another person who acts in a very positive manner but proclaims nothing.
So.
Right?
Okay, so maybe we got somewhat of a concession here. He says someone can act in a positive manner, but still proclaim nothing of propositional beliefs. And is that good? Is that as full as a belief or faith should be? Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd like for him to explore that more, because if he does, or if someone does act but does not proclaim proposition, does he actually believe? He just compared it to the opposite, proclaim yet not act, and this so far has not been sufficient for genuine belief. So why can't it maybe be inverted? Again, I'm not even saying that is the case, but how would he respond to that?
What I'm kind of seeing is like a descriptive, a really comprehensive but descriptive analysis of human action, human thought, and by which we can characterize people and put people in boxes. When I say in boxes, I mean like I can categorize you based on your actions, not based on necessarily what you say, but based on your actions that you are more so or less so Christian, right? Things like that, right? So we can categorize people as Christian.
Well, I would say more or less voluntarily self-sacrificing.
And at the end of it all, Peterson just circles back to his original definition of what we started, is a Christian is largely a Christian if he voluntarily self-sacrifices more or less.
But that's also what we came to, though, is that someone can be like 60% or 70% Christian based on simply just acting in that way.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins is like that.
Okay, so in conclusion, it appears that someone is a Christian on some kind of spectrum so long as the majority of their moral life is oriented toward voluntary self-sacrifice. Peterson considered voluntary self-sacrifice plus other elements, but never quite specified, and when pushed, he resorted back to merely needing voluntary self-sacrifice to grant someone a place on this Christian spectrum. And kind of naturally, propositional belief is not necessary to be a Christian, Peterson's Christian, but propositional belief will enhance that person's Christian status. So the strength of his argument is he's consistent with the voluntary self-sacrifice as the primary determiner to grant someone place on the Christian identifier spectrum that he proposes, and I guess that's the only strength I can find right now. Weaknesses, a few. The self-gravitation semantics, again, this is where Peterson puts the burden on his opponent to conform to his lexicon, his dictionary, to use words and operate with words the same as him. And if you don't, it's game over for you in the argument, which is unfair. It's not good faith. The playing ground is not leveled, and he's not doing the same work equally to understand them as they are having to understand him in his propositions. Another weakness is equivocation of the term Christian. Again, this term is used interchangeably. It's used for the Christian that he is arguing, the voluntary self-sacrifice. It's used for the quote-unquote Christian thought that he reverts to in history. the Christian domain as well. So he's using a word interchangeably without yet having defined it, because that's the whole purpose of this section, is for him to define it, and he takes massive liberty there. And then circular reasoning with defining Christian. What is a Christian? A Christian is what a Christian was, what a Christian is, and what a Christian did. And just the counter intuition with treating religious identity. It's a lot of hurdles and obstacles to really just understand what is a person faith-wise, belief-wise. And there's just an inherent difficulty that Peterson makes for that, as I said, kind of sets him up for the Peterson paradox. If all individuals scrutinized Christianity or identified as being a Christian as you, we would have no Christians, and you would have no Christianity to learn whether you are or are not a Christian. And all these weaknesses, they exclude critique of his biblical exegesis and interpretation of the Bible, from which he derives his theological conclusions. That could be a whole separate video. I just kind of want to treat this broadly for how kind of sound and philosophically coherent his argumentation was, which in my opinion was not very great. All right, thanks for watching.